Hello everyone, we are continuing on our module 3 and that is on pigments, and we have been looking into a range of material starting from the cave or the rock shelters of Bhimbetka to the cave of Ajanta, and then we have also looked into Sittanavasal and so on. So we will be continuing on our discussion on the use of pigments, and today we will be starting our discussion with the another site which is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site just like Ajanta and Bhimbetka, that is Ellora. So Ellora is also situated in the same Aurangabad district as Ajanta is, and but these two sites are almost in the distance of 30 kilometers or 30 to 40 kilometers between each other. Now in Ellora we also see similar kind of programmatic that we have seen in Ajanta. For example, how the living rock structures were excavated to make this rock shelters as well as these caves, and this can also be compared to the ones we have seen in Sittanavasal as well as in Bagh and so on. So here what we find that this Deccan basalt rock out of which this rock formations, the plateau landscape is made. So those rock formations are being carved and excavated, and through that the caves were produced. So these caves, we find there are around 34 caves in the site of Ellora, which were being made from 600 BC to 600 AD to 1000 AD. And during this time period, we find that not only one religion but three religions have flourished in this place. So we find there are Jain caves, there are Buddhist caves, as well as there are Hindu caves. Now the caves which we find there, so the 1 to 12 we find they are the ones which are the Buddhist caves, and then we have the ones, so the Buddhist caves are also the ones which have been the earliest ones in the entire group. So between 5th and 8th century AD these caves were excavated. And then we also find there are other caves, for example the Brahminical caves or the Hindu caves. So those will be the ones from 13 to 29, and those are the ones we find that they have developed between 7th to 10th century AD. And then we also have the Jain caves or the Jaina caves, and those will be the ones between like 30 to 34. And the Jaina caves were developed between 9th to 10th century and it also went beyond. So the time period of Ellora, even though I say that between 600 AD and 1000 AD, that was the time when most of these developments were happening. However, we can also see that some of the caves, they were started being built before that, and some of them also were built after this time period. So by 600 to 1000, this is the time period I mentioned, which we can imagine as when most of the activities were concentrated in. Now what we see here in terms of the architecture, that we also see similar kind of programmatic, as I have said, that there are number of those prayer halls, the monasteries or like the vihara structures, and then there are temples. So these are the kind of the arrangements which we have already seen in the context of Ajanta. We have already seen similar kind of strategies being used for carving these living rock structures in Sittanavasal, and here we see in Ellora as well. Now if on screen we are looking at the cave number 16, and that is the Kailasha temple, and that is perhaps one of the most celebrated caves in the site of Ellora. However, and that was made in the 8th century AD. Now we have not really gotten into the Hindu architecture, and that's the reason I won't be touching upon the details of the temple building, which we will be addressing in one of the later modules. So but what we find here, a very specific information about this particular temple, is that the carving of the rock structures that started from the top of the temple and then it sort of went downwards, which is usually the opposite emulate what happens in a temple building, that we start from the base and then slowly, like the towers, the shikhara and the other elements are added on the top of it. So since this is a living rock structure, that I mean the entire structure is carved out of living rock, and that is the reason perhaps we find that there was a very different way of carving the temple that took place in this particular site, which is not the usual case. Now, going with the kind of images that we find, then in some of the caves we have remains of the murals that those were there in this cave sites. Now, as we can imagine that, I mean, there were not one but three religion was involved in the same site. So we can imagine that there might have been a huge number of pilgrims and monks and ascetics and nuns and so on. They were active part of these cave sites, and that is the reason we also find that how a number of these caves were decorated with paintings, the interior mostly I'm addressing here. Now, here we find that there are some of the murals, and we have two of the representation of the images here on screen. Now, one of the one in the left side that we find here, it is a Jaina mural, and in this one we have one of the Tirthankaras as standing tall, and of course the central in the central part of this image. And in this particular image, what we find that some of the iconographical traditions or the conventions that we have already studied so far, they have also been carried forward in these images here as well. Now, for example, what we find here in this image, that this is Jaina monk or the Tirthankara that is projected at the center stage of this image. Here we find that, I mean, this Tirthankara has also been shown as with broad shoulder, with the thin vest, and of course with the long earlobes. So the long earlobes are usually been associated with the intelligent ones as well as the enlightened ones, who have who are not only just intelligent, but they also have the ears to listen to people's sorrows and people's problems. And that is how it is a sign that, I mean, the devotee's problems will be addressed by the deity. So these are some of those iconographical conventions that we find they were already been established, and those signs are also carried forward in the murals in Ellora. Now, the dating of these murals that usually we find, the ones we have on screen, they are probably between 8th to 11th century AD. Now, what we also find here, that there is already a prominence of the lines. So the lines have always been a very important and integral part of the murals and any other kind of painted images in India. And with time we find that the importance of line have manifested in many different ways. So for example, in the image that we have in the left side, we see that, I mean, it is not just the lines which will have very prominent outlines as such, but these are the lines which have the calligraphic quality, which are varied. A same line can be varied in their depth, and that is how the depth of the body, as well as some of the parts which are more important than the others, those things are emphasized. And the other thing that we also find, that, I mean, how the modulation of the body, that also happens around the lines, the contour lines. So the entire body of this Jaina figure that we find, that, I mean, the entire body is not really three-dimensional as such. However, that the areas around the arms and the body, around the contour lines, there we find the slight hint of shading or gradation, the tonal variation, and that is what that amplifies this three-dimensional quality of the body. So this is something that we find that it is not completely three-dimensional, but the hint of the rounded body has been projected here. And this rounded body, this has been achieved by this highly skillful calligraphic lines, as well as the selective shading or the tonal variation that had also been employed. Now we also find that there are some of the other characteristic features here. For example, the halo behind the head, which also suggests the divinity of this figure, and similar to the other images that we have seen in Ajanta and so on, here are also some of the very lyrical as well as elegant attendant figures. So for example, if we see that, I mean, there is a very elegant woman who we see that, I mean, she is standing right beside the central figure, and she has similar kind of elegance, as well as the bends of the body. They are also reminders of the ones we have seen in Ajanta. Then we also see there are some of the other figures. For example, here the celestial beings, so the ones who are above the ground level, and both these figures, they appear from both sides of the image, and they also direct the viewer's gaze towards the central part of this image, and they are the ones, they are flying. And the flying, that is something that is suggested by their gesture, by their posture of their legs. So they are the ones who are flying on the sky. They are not walking or they are not running. So that is something that is suggested by the posture of their legs. So there is no other wings or anything else is added to their body, but their position in the entire mural, as well as the posture of their legs, that is something, those are the ones which are signifier of their status as the celestial beings or these divine beings. Now they are the ones we also find that they are arriving to greet the central figure in this image, something a similar kind of strategy that we have already seen in Ajanta as well. Now these are some of the issues. We find that there are some similarities and differences between Ajanta and the murals in Ellora. We find that the kind of the details, or like, I mean, the dedication towards the compositional arrangement, as well as maintaining a narrative integrity that was there in Ajanta. Some of the murals in Ellora might be responding to that, but mostly we also find that they are moving slightly on a different paradigm with their image making practice. And those are the things that might happen because of different kind of interaction with the people who are the visual practitioners, but that can also happen because of the modes of patronage. Now, an example of that will probably be the image that we have in the right side of the screen, and that is Shiva Nataraja. And of course, as you can imagine that, I mean, this image will come from one of the Hindu caves. Now, this is also a sign that, I mean, some of the early images of Shiva Nataraja, that shows that, I mean, how the image of Nataraja was perceived, and how the image was depicted in the two-dimensional ground, because we usually know the Nataraja image in the three-dimensional form. However, there are temple murals and murals in the caves as such, which also display the two-dimensional depiction. Now, what happens in this particular image, that we find that the dynamism of this image has been given much more priority than the anatomy. So, for example, we have the prominent face of Shiva, and also, like, I mean, who's painted in this bright yellow pigment. And we find that, I mean, the face of Shiva, who's also which is also adorned by his jata mukuta, the crown he wears, which is made out of matted locks, and then the earrings and so on. And then we also see his large eyes, and then we also see that, I mean, how he is bejeweled and heavily ornamented, as opposed to being shown as an ascetic. However, what we see here, that, I mean, his head is not really in the proportion of the body the way usually the Indian artistic anatomy works out. So a kind of anatomy that we find in Ajanta, and that perhaps also gave rise to the kind of Talamana system or the system of measurement or iconography and iconometry. So those are the things we do not really see being implemented similarly in this image of Nataraja. What we find in this image of Nataraja, however, is that how the hand gestures, the movement of Shiva's eyes, as well as the slight bent in his face, and then of course the way, like I mean all his hands and his feet, they sort of cover the entire picture plane, and they sort of reach out to the furthest ends of this picture. So that sort of adds to the dynamism of this image, and this is also something that we can imagine, that how the idea of the dance or the Ananda Tandava, that is the dance which Shiva is known to have performed. So the essence of the dance has become much more important here, the dynamism, the movement, and how his different limbs and how the color variation and everything else, they add to this dynamism that had given much more priority than maintaining this the anatomical proportions and so on. So we are not really making here a value judgment of how the Ajanta murals are different from this one. So we are not saying the Ajanta murals are superior than the Ellora murals. However, we can see that there are certain degree of differences. So the differences are much more important than actually coming into a value judgment and saying that this is better and that is not. So from there, we also wanted to bring our attention towards the materiality of this paintings, and this is this one particular image I wanted to show here, and this comes from one of the Jaina caves, and this was perhaps made between 9th and 10th century AD. What we have here, that I mean a part of the image had been deteriorated, and that is how we see that I mean how this surface of the rock, this basalt surface has been revealed in the left side of the image, and then we see there are the layers of the lime plaster that is also revealed in this image, and then on the top of that there are the application of pigment based paints, and that is how the images are executed. Now there are certain kind of features of this of the entire this murals which needs to be addressed, and that is that I mean we can see how the rock surfaces are built. So each of these steps in making these murals are very important for sustaining them as well as making them stay on the wall, and that is that I mean here we see the walls, the way they are carved, it is not really even, but I mean it's very abrupt and uneven, and this has been done for a very particular reason, that if the walls are very smooth, then it becomes difficult for it to have the the thick plaster, the thick lime plasters to hold on to them. So it requires this uneven surface to make the friction, so that I mean the lime plaster, this thick layer of the lime plaster which is applied on the top of it can stay on to it. So that is the reason we find that each and every steps which are associated and which are involved in making these images are crucial. So from there what we also find that the lime plaster which is added on the top of it also must have followed a similar kind of a strategy as the ones we have seen in Ajanta, that the lime plaster was completely dried before the painting practice had actually begun. So afterwards we find that on the lime plaster the images were drawn, and perhaps some kind of like iron oxide or charcoal charcoal, those kind of materials were used for drawing the initial images. So for example, we usually find that how the contour lines are usually drawn at the beginning, and then of course, like the contour lines of the figures. So the ones we find to be the central figures here, so their contour lines, the images which are also associated there, so they are the ones also been drawn first, the outlines of the contour lines, and then slowly on the top of that we find the application of the paint, the pigment based paint take place. So usually in a painting like this, what we will find that the colors which are on the lighter tone will be applied first. So here if we see that there is a combination of this earthy red and brown and slightly darker towards black and a greenish tone, these are the ones which are applied here. Then perhaps at the beginning this earthy red was applied first on the bodies, and then we see that the slight hint of modulation might have also been added with a slightly darker tone of the same color, or it might have been mixed with a little bit of brown. And then we also see that how the other colors are being added in by the sides, and there is a tremendous importance of the color balance. So that is the reason what we find that how the use of red is complemented by the use of brown and green. So in the entire scene, the balance between these colors have been maintained superbly. And then after the application of these initial patches of color, or like filling the bodies and so on, then the ornaments we find here and so on, and the crown and so on, these are the ones which are added afterwards. And for adding the ornaments, we find usually that how a color which will be much more in a lighter tone, for example yellow mixed with white or red mixed with white and so on, those are the ones which are used there. So with these things, what we also find that in these cases, this tonal variation, that is the tonal variation between this central figure and the ones who are the adjoining ones, those are enhanced by the use of these ornaments, as well as how this lighter this touches of these lighter tones, they punctuate the importance of certain figures more than the others. So afterwards we find that perhaps towards the end, the darker tones and so on, those are the ones which are added. And then at the end, either the highlights in the ornaments, they are added, or like the highlights of the ornaments are added before application of the most the darkest tone. So these are the kind of like processes we find them to be employed in making these murals, and this is something we find not only prevalent in these murals in Ellora, but in a number of the places. However, this is just a basic description of how this color strategy and the scheme works out, but it's not like that there are no back and forth, that it's also not like that there are no other ways to apply the colors. So but this is usually the way, like from the light tone to the dark tone, usually like the painting process progresses, and at the end or towards the end, the ornaments and the places where the highlights are being drawn, they are added. Now one other thing that we must also remember, that this particular way of painting, or this particular way in which all the details are added, those are also been possible because of the opacity of the colors. So as I have already mentioned in the earlier lectures, that the colors were opaque in their nature, so they are pretty thick. We are not talking about watercolors which are really light, and the patches of the watercolor are just very light patches of watercolor are applied onto either walls or paper. But we are talking about that how a thick layers of the colors are applied onto these surfaces, so that this the opacity of the figures as well as the objects and all the other elements can be enhanced. And that is something we find in most of the mural paintings in India, and that is not something that just started in Ajanta or in Ellora or Sittanavasal, but this particular way of application of the colors that started from the 2nd century BC, at least from Ajanta, we see them to be continued in the medieval times, early modern times, and even in the later times.